Sometime in 547, with most of Italy under his control, Totila sent envoys to Theudebert, king of the Austrasian Franks, proposing a marriage alliance. Totila asked for the hand of a Frankish princess, Theudebert's daughter. His goal was the formation of a Western bloc that could rival Justinian's Eastern Empire. Theudebert seemed like an obvious partner. He was committed to stepping out of Constantinople's shadow and had previously attempted to unite the other barbarian kingdoms and launch an invasion of Thrace. Surely he'd jump at the chance to stick it to Justinian. But to Totila's surprise, Theudebert refused the offer. His reason cut Totila deeply. Theudebert stated that Totila was not, nor could he ever be, the true lord of Italy, because, having once held the city of Rome, Totila had let it go without a fight. Theudebert's refusal and his reasoning stung. Humiliated, Totila committed to making amends for this mistake. Totila made a grave error when he abandoned Rome in 547. He felt that the city's strategic and economic value was minimal, and he wasn't wrong on those counts, but he failed to grasp the political value in holding Rome. And it seems like he was the only one who couldn't see that political value. Belisarius recognized it. He begged Totila not to destroy the city after the siege of 546. But that made sense. Belisarius was a Roman general, after all. Surely he'd have some respect for the city that founded his empire. But Theudebert? Theudebert had never even seen Rome with his own eyes, yet he was willing to reject an alliance over it. This must have made Totila realize just how badly he'd fumbled when he let Rome slip away. The rejection hurt him on many levels. Totila was the king of Italy and had nearly run Justinian's army off the peninsula. But that still didn't make him strong enough in Theudebert's eyes. The Ostrogoths and the Franks had alliances in the past. Theudebert the Great had been married to Autofleda, the sister of Clovis. But now, Clovis's grandson was brushing off one of Theoderic's successors, and all because he had given up a virtually abandoned city, a city that was barely a ghost of its former self. But what I think is most interesting about Theudebert's rejection isn't the reaction of Totila, it's what it foreshadowed. Fast forward about 200 years. The Franks are now the most dominant kingdom in the West. Rome is a part of the Papal States, thanks to Pepin the Short, another Frankish king. The city's nominal protector is still the emperor in Constantinople, but the emperors have long failed to protect it. And so, once again, the Franks are the ones who step in and pick up the slack, defending the city and, more notably, the papacy from various threats. This dynamic leads to the famous coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in 800, and for the first time in centuries, two emperors, one in the east and one in the west. The Eastern emperor at the time, or should I say empress, was Irene of Athens, and in the eyes of Pope Leo, Irene, like Totila, was not worthy of holding supreme power over Rome because Irene and her predecessors had failed to defend Rome. And just as Theudebert passed judgment on Totila, Leo passed judgment on Irene and crowned Charlemagne. In the eyes of the Franks, to be a Roman in the West meant holding, respecting, and protecting Rome itself. And in both these cases, the Franks were more than happy to fill the role voided by someone else. Totila, though, unlike Irene 2.5 centuries later, had the ability to actually pressure Rome and to show that he did, in fact, have the power to hold it and to defend it. So in 549, he surrounded the Eternal City for the second time in 3 years. This would be the third time during the Gothic War that an Ostrogothic army entrapped the Eternal City, with each siege further stripping Rome of its defenses and its dignity. The first siege of Rome, which took place from March 537 until March of 538, was marked by Belisarius's brilliant defense. The second siege, from late 545 through late 546, is famous for the great suffering it brought on the people of Rome. But this siege, beginning in mid-549, would be different. Totila learned his lesson from 546, and as the siege began, occupied Portus and Ostia, the two ports that could potentially resupply Rome via the Tiber from the Mediterranean. Inside Rome's walls, the city was largely abandoned from the previous siege. It was so empty that the Roman garrison was able to grow enough food within the walls to feed themselves. I need to emphasize that. This large urban center was so deserted that the army was able to turn it into farmland arable enough to supply themselves throughout a siege. This is about 2.5 years after Totila walked through the Asinarian Gate. Just 2.5 years to go from bustling metropolis to abandoned fields. That's a massive decline. The garrison wasn't large, only about 3,000 men, and it was led by Diogenes, one of Belisarius's personal guards. Diogenes was more aggressive than Bessus had been during the previous siege, partly because he wasn't profiting off the suffering of others as Bessus was, but that wasn't going to make up for Totila's superior numbers. And Diogenes had another problem. The imperial treasury was, yet again, behind on pay. This keeps coming up, and one of the reasons for that is that Justinian expected tax revenue from Italy to help finance the army in Italy. But it was very difficult for the Romans to collect taxes when Totila controlled much of the peninsula and the army was mostly held up in various fortresses. Revenue was simply not coming in. So when Totila encircled the city in the early summer of 549, the garrison was already more than a little perturbed. It was not going to be hard for Totila to bring this garrison to its knees. He didn't need relentless attacks on the city's repaired walls, or even heavy siege equipment. All he needed to do was to wait, and the garrison would break all on its own. During the previous siege, it took a full year for the garrison to fall to its knees. This time, it would only take about 8 months. Fed up with the lack of pay and the poor conditions, a band of Isaurians in the Roman garrison decided to open the gate of St. Paul for Totila. Now, some viewers might notice that this sounds very much like the end of the siege of 545-546. Because in 546, a group of Isaurians agreed to open the Asinarian Gate for Totila. But this time, a different group of Isaurians agreed to open the Gate of St. Paul. So, completely different. This gate, not this gate. On the night that the betrayal was to take place, Totila sent trumpeters up the Tiber as a distraction. When the trumpeters approached the city walls, they began sounding their horns. This caused panic within the city, with the Romans believing that the trumpets were helping to coordinate a major attack. Everyone abandoned their posts and rushed to the source of the sound. Everyone, that is, except for the Isaurians. They stayed behind at the Gate of St. Paul, as planned. With the rest of the army distracted, they opened the doors and allowed Totila's men to enter unopposed. As the enemy entered the city, word quickly spread that the Ostrogoths had breached the walls, and the Roman garrison panicked into a disorganized retreat. Diogenes hightailed out the Aurelian Gate, only to run directly into an Ostrogothic ambush. Totila had planned for this possibility, and he had men waiting along the road out of the city. Most of Diogenes' men were slaughtered. Meanwhile, another high-ranking officer named Paulus escaped the walls with a few hundred horsemen and took refuge in the mausoleum of Hadrian. Here, Totila initiated a mini-siege, surrounding the mausoleum in an attempt to starve the stragglers out. The mausoleum had no provisions inside. With no real options, the men considered butchering and eating their horses, but couldn't bear to do so. After only a day, they were prepared to charge out and meet certain death, planning to take as many Ostrogoths with them as they could. Totila knew that that would be their only option, though, and didn't want to risk unnecessary losses, so he instead offered them a deal. If the men would lay down their arms and leave their horses behind, they would be free to head back to Constantinople. Or they could keep their arms and their horses, remain in Italy, and enlist in the Ostrogothic army. And of course there was the third option, fighting their way out, which would have led to certain death. Paulus decided to return to Constantinople. Most of his men chose to enlist in Totila's army. The Ostrogoths spent the next few days rounding up any remaining Roman soldiers still hiding within the city. They were all given this same offer: fight with us, or surrender your arms and be free to go on your way. Almost all accepted the offer to fight alongside Totila. This third siege of Rome didn't have heroic defenses or a daring rescue attempt. No famous sorties or ingenious strategies. Just a heavily weakened and nearly abandoned city being handed over in the dark of night by unpaid guardsmen. Ironically, Totila was right. This city just wasn't worth it. The war had destroyed it. It didn't even have one great fight left in it. Procopius only dedicates a few pages to this siege. There just wasn't much that happened, which is symbolic of Rome's overall decline. The grandeur was gone. After taking possession of the city, Totila, clearly reacting to Theudebert's rejection, offered to bring the Senate back and to rebuild the city. Few senators took him up on his offer. Rome was no longer a city that the elites yearned to return to. This shows just how far Rome had fallen over the course of the Gothic War. In 534, 1 year before Belisarius' invasion began, Rome wasn't the city it once was at its peak, but it still clung to its ancient identity. The Senate still met, and consuls were still appointed. The consul no longer carried real power, but the ancient office still held weight. It was a living relic of the Republican past. That year, Athalaric, the grandson of Theodoric the Great, appointed the last man to ever hold the consulship in the West. 16 years later, Rome was devastated by war, The consular office was vacant, and the Senate itself had been run from the city. After the Gothic War, the Senate mostly disappeared from the historical record. There are only 4 mentions of the Roman Senate in primary sources between 550 and 603, when its final recorded meeting took place. And even that 603 meeting was convened by the Pope and included both the Senate and the Roman clergy. The Senate were the sidekicks here. Its power, its mystique, had vanished. You could look at the next 50 or so years as a passing of the torch, the Senate fading and the clergy rising. The city's aura no longer coming from the governmental body, but from a spiritual one. This entire transition, from a powerful city at the heart of an empire to a religious center that guides kings and queens, didn't happen overnight. It had started long before the Gothic War and would continue long after it. But this war, and in particular these sieges, really accelerated this transition. It's here, in 550, with Rome back in Ostrogothic hands, that we see the roots of the medieval period taking hold. The echoes of antiquity would still linger. We'll see prominent examples of this later in the Gothic War. But the trajectory is clear. The Senate is on its way out the door to be replaced by the clergy. A Frankish king is establishing himself as the city's protector, if only from afar and only in a political sense. And Rome is no longer able to defend itself in any way, but now relies on outside forces to hold it up. In this crumbling shell of Rome, we see the Middle Ages begin to rise.